Constitutional Convention finally adjourned on the 17th of September, and the delegates left. A woman asked Ben Franklin, "What sort of government have you given us?" And he replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." And that's been the challenge ever since. And the first part of the challenge was getting this Constitution ratified. Now, in the ratification debates, we saw some good arguments on both sides. This was not the pro-America or anti-America faction. Both of the sides were composed of good, loyal, patriotic Americans who simply had some different views as to exactly how the principles of the Declaration of Independence ought to be implemented. The Anti-Federalists raised some strong arguments, and in fact, George Washington credited them with having contributed to an understanding as to how the Constitution should be interpreted. But they started out with some initial disadvantages. First of all, the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, came out expropriating that term Federalist for themselves. Now, the term federalism was a very popular word. Federalism simply meant the idea of shared power, some power at a central level and other power reserved to the various states. That dualism of power was what federalism was all about, and everybody in America at that time was a Federalist. So when the Federalists came out of the convention calling themselves Federalists, they had a propaganda advantage right from the beginning because they had appropriated a name that everybody would identify with, and when their opponents allowed themselves to be called the Anti-Federalists, well, that probably was not the wisest move. The Federalists had another advantage too, and that's that they had been in this convention for the past several months, and they had gone over the Constitution syllable by syllable. They knew it forward and backward. Most of the Anti-Federalists had no inkling of what it was about until the convention was over with. And so the Federalists got an initial start in their campaign much ahead of their opponents. One of the ways they supported the Constitution and persuaded people to ratify it was through the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a series of essays written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay for the purpose of persuading the people to support the Constitution. I require my students to read the Federalist Papers, and they usually tell me that they find them fascinating, but they often say that it's the most difficult and challenging thing they've ever had to read in their academic careers. I tell them I can understand why, because the Federalist Papers were written for a very sophisticated audience, the farmers of colonial New York, and that with your educational background, you can't be expected to approach their level of intellectual sophistication. But if you really pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you might come close, and some of the students do. The Anti-Federalists raised some strong arguments against the Constitution, and they had some effective leaders. Patrick Henry was the most eloquent opponent of the Constitution. Joining him was George Mason, for whom a law school is named today and whom some describe as the father of the Bill of Rights, Richard Henry Lee, and many others. Among their arguments were first that the whole convention itself had proceeded in an illegitimate way, that the Congress had simply authorized this convention to revise the articles, not to draft a whole new Constitution. While the delegates themselves had considered that, General Pinckney of South Carolina raised that objection in some of the initial stages, their basic conclusion, though, seemed to be that since whatever we decide here in this convention has to be approved by Congress and then sent to the states for ratification, we can do anything we want here, and if Congress and the states don't like it, they don't have to accept it and they can send it back to committee. They also argued that, yes, there may be some problems with the Articles of the Confederation, but they don't require a whole revision, a whole new Constitution like this. Just a few amendments here and there would correct the problem. The problem with that argument, of course, was that any amendment had to be approved by all 13 states, and Rhode Island seemed unlikely to approve anything. They argued that the lack of a Bill of Rights could be very dangerous. They argued that a republic could succeed only in a small nation, and they cited Baron Montesquieu to this effect, that a larger nation tended toward being an empire. And so what we need, they said, is a confederation of republics, going from New Hampshire down to Georgia, and have them loosely confederated, but basic state sovereignty. They argued that there were not enough representatives in Congress and there were no guarantees of reapportionment. They said generally the federal government had too much power. One of the concerns they raised was that Congress controlled both the Treasury and the military. As Patrick Henry argued in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, if you put the purse and the sword in the same hand, inevitably this is going to lead to despotism. And finally, they argued that judicial review, power of the courts to strike down what Congress does, could be very dangerous. In some ways, you might say the Anti-Federalists were very far-sighted in seeing some problems. Now let's look at the Constitution itself. Let's see what are these instructions that the Founding Fathers have given us for the form of government that we have in America today. James Madison says concerning the Constitution that every word of it decides a question of liberty and power. That's what the Constitution is all about. How much power do we give to the government? How much power do we retain from the government? How much power do we limit the government? And when we give power to the government, to which branch should we give it? And what restrictions should be placed on how that power should be exercised? That relationship between liberty and power is what the Constitution is all about. The Constitution begins with the Preamble, which simply says, "We, the people of the United States." And that shows the contractual nature of government, how we, the people, have formed it. It shows that government is derived from the consent of the governed. And then it sets forth the basic purposes for which their government is being founded. To form a more perfect union, that is, end the disunity that characterized this nation under the Articles. To establish justice. There was no court system, you recall, under the Articles, no federal court system. To ensure domestic tranquility, there had been instances of insurrection and disturbance like Shays' Rebellion. To provide for the common defense, that had been a problem with the lack of taxing ability. To promote the general welfare, note this does not mean the specific welfare of individuals or regions or socioeconomic groups, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Note this shows, first of all, their fundamental concern for liberty. It shows that they intended the Constitution to be a permanent document, as John Marshall called it, a constitution for the ages. And it shows their concern for future generations, and possibly it could even be interpreted to show a concern for unborn children as well. And then they simply say, "We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Now, a couple things to notice about the Preamble. One, you'll notice that it simply states purposes. There are no powers delegated to the federal government in the Preamble. A couple of the phrases you see are repeated in Article 1, but the Preamble by itself grants no powers to the federal government. It just states purposes. Notice, secondly, that the Preamble is brief, and I believe it's brief because the actual Preamble is the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence is really a more fundamental and more organic law of the United States than is the Constitution, because the Declaration sets forth the basic ideals on which this nation is based. We then move into Article 1, and you might remember these three articles. We've got three branches of government. Article 1 is the legislature, Article 2 is the executive, the president, Article 3 is the judiciary, the court. You can remember them in that order. If you're looking in the Constitution to find some specific provision, that might help you in knowing where to turn. Section 1 simply establishes a bicameral, or that is two-house Congress, consisting of a House of Representatives that is popularly elected and represents people by district, and a Senate. Now, until the year 1915, with the 17th Amendment, we did not vote in popular elections for our senators. Prior to that time, your state legislature would choose who Virginia's two senators would be. Now, there was an advantage to that. It gave the states a direct check on what the federal government was doing, because those who made up one branch of the Congress were appointed directly by the legislatures themselves. We have gone away from that to popular election, And this is part of the change from the constitutional republic to the kind of democracy that means unbridled majority rule. Now, why have two houses? Well, there are several reasons. Roger Sherman of Connecticut suggested the idea, but it was partially a parallel to the English Parliament. And in the English Parliament, you've got the House of Commons, which is kind of a robust body and tends to be a little more common, represents the common people. The House was like that in many respects. People would sometimes come, bring their guns, or maybe even their hunting dogs with them to Congress and so on. You wouldn't do that in the Senate. The Senate was more like the House of Lords. They served longer terms. They were smaller for 13 states. That meant only 26 senators, and so they were a much more aristocratic and deliberative body, much like the House of Lords in England. There's another reason for having two houses. Supposedly, although I guess this can't be documented, there was a conversation between Washington and Jefferson after Jefferson returned to the United States. And Jefferson asked Washington why they had decided to have two houses. Washington asked, well, why do you pour your tea back and forth between your cup and your saucer? And Jefferson said, to cool it and to soothe it. Washington says, that's why we pour legislation back and forth between the House and the Senate, to cool it and to soothe it. Now, this means then that sometimes the will of a majority can be thwarted by a two-house legislature. And yes, and that is exactly what the framers intended. They did not intend a democracy in the pure sense of the word that we often use the term today. Now, if you read through the Federalist Papers, you find the common term that the founders use is a Confederate republic. They do sometimes use the term democracy there in a broad sense, just simply meaning representative government. But in the sense of unbridled, unfettered majority rule, Madison, particularly in the Federalist Papers, condemns democracy in very, very strong terms. What's the difference between a democracy and a republic? Well, first, Republican government is more indirect. It's through elected representatives. The pure democracies like ancient Greece, where most of the cities in Greece were despotisms, and those that were democracies only lasted for very short periods of time and were characterized by instability, even then, they simply didn't work. In fact, Russell Kirk, in his book, The Roots of American Order, says that our founding fathers looked to the Greeks primarily as an example of what did not work. But second difference would be that in a republic, the law is supreme. Remember in Daniel chapter 6, where we read repeatedly of the law of the Medes and the Persians, which changeth not, that when a decree is issued by the king, even the king himself is powerless to change it. The idea that even rulers are subject to law. As John Adams defined it, the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. And third, in a republic, the minority has rights that even a majority cannot take away. If the Virginia legislature wants to abolish your right to freedom of speech because you espouse all kinds of flaky ideas like constitutionalism, if the court is doing its job properly, they'll strike that down as unconstitutional, even if 70% of the people of the state want your right of freedom of speech abolished, because you have rights as a minority that even the majority cannot take away. Sections 2 through 6 then simply provide for the way the House and Senate are to be composed and provide that they can adopt their own rules and procedures. Section 7 sets forth the nature of the legislative process and provides that revenue bills have to originate in the House. Now, why do they originate in the House rather than the Senate? Well, the answer is at that time, the House was a popularly elected body. The Senate was appointed by the state legislatures. And so if the people are going to pay the taxes, the people are going to have to initiate any taxes. It goes on to say that legislation starts in Congress. The president can only suggest bills. He cannot actually introduce them. The president has the power to veto bills, subject to being overridden by 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Section 8 is possibly the most significant section of the entire Constitution in terms of the powers that it delegates to Congress. First of all, the taxing and spending power of Section 8, Clause 1 provides that Congress may tax and spend for the payment of debts, for the common defense, and for the general welfare of the United States. Those are the only purposes for which Congress may tax and spend. Now, the one that has been most controversial here has been the General Welfare Clause. There's a grant of power there, but there's also a limitation. Remember, every word in a statute is presumed to have meaning. General welfare wasn't just a nice phrase put in there. They didn't insert the word general just because they needed a few extra syllables for rhythm. They used it to qualify what types of welfare Congress could spend for. And by not mentioning specific welfare, that meant that Congress could not tax and spend for the specific welfare of individuals or groups or regions. We've gradually seen this changed. In a famous case, U.S. versus Butler, involving a tax upon agriculture middlemen, elevator operators and the like, to pay a farm subsidy to the farmers, we saw the Supreme Court, a conservative 5-4 majority, strike this legislation down as unconstitutional. They did so, saying that this was for the specific welfare of this group, farmers, not for the general welfare of the nation as a whole. But by 1937, we see a change in the court's philosophy. Roosevelt has tried to pack the court, and Justice Charles Evans Hughes appears to have changed his philosophy just to take the heat off the court. And so the 5-4 liberal majority in the Stewart Machine Company says that the Social Security tax is constitutional, even though it is spending money only for this specific group of Social Security recipients. The court says, yes, they're broad enough, that's a broad enough group, and besides that, they're going to be spending the money on things that will stimulate the economy as a whole, so we think that's broad enough to be general welfare. Well, the practical effect of this, and subsequent cases, is that the distinction between the general welfare and the specific welfare has been virtually obliterated. Now, just to give you an example of what I mean, I might suggest that you write to your congressman and ask for about a $10 million appropriation for my favorite charity, the John Eidsmoe Benevolent Fund, which goes to the benevolence of John Eidsmoe. Now, I will use that money to promote the general welfare. For example, I'll buy a ski condo maybe over in Vail, but well, I don't think I want to ski all the time, so I'll buy another down on South Padre Island and so on, and then I better have a fleet of cars to convey me back and forth, and maybe a Learjet and so on. And notice how this is going to promote the construction industry and the real estate industry, the lumber industry, how it's going to promote the automobile industry, all the jobs in Detroit I'm going to be creating out of this and so on. Well, that's ridiculous, but that is the basis of the court's reasoning here. And what the court has effectively done is, as you read the Constitution, they have in effect crossed out that word general, and they have basically said that the government can tax for welfare, general, whatever they want to tax for. Clause 2 provides that Congress may borrow money. Clause 3 provides that Congress may regulate 3 types of commerce: that with foreign nations, that with Indian tribes, which are treated sort of as nations within nations, and then that among the several states. And you might notice what type of commerce is missing. What type of commerce we, the people, did not delegate to Congress the authority to regulate. Intra-state commerce, commerce within the state itself. And when we speak about commerce, we're not speaking about the manufacturing or production process. What you do in your own factory, that is not interstate commerce. And a series of cases held exactly that. The Hammer versus Dagenhart case, for example, in 1918, Carter versus Carter Cole in 1936. And then there was a case, the Houston Railway case, in which the Supreme Court said that if we're going to regulate tariff rates for train tickets all across the United States, that in order to effectuate a comprehensive scheme of regulation, it may be necessary to regulate intrastate commerce as well. In other words, if we're regulating the price of train tickets to go from Shreveport, Louisiana to Albuquerque, New Mexico, well, we may have to regulate the price from Dallas, which is right on the way, to Abilene as well. And so to effectuate a comprehensive scheme, of regulation of interstate commerce, Congress can regulate intra-state commerce as well. Well, you can see the logic behind that, but you can also see where it leads. In 1937, then, we see a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court where the court says that Congress can regulate labor disputes. Jones and Laughlin Steele had said, National Labor Relations Board, butt out, this is not your business. This is an internal matter of manufacturing and production. It does not concern interstate commerce. But the court said, well, we think that if there are unresolved labor strikes, this could lead to a shutdown of steel production. A shutdown of steel production could lead to a shutdown of the free flow of steel in interstate commerce. And so in order to preserve the free flow of steel in interstate commerce, it may be necessary for Congress to regulate labor disputes in production, and so the Commerce Clause gives the Supreme Court the power to do exactly that. Then they went a step further in 1941 in U.S. versus Darby, and they said that Congress may regulate the production, manufacturing conditions, wages, hours, and the like, of any goods which you intend to produce in interstate commerce. In other words, you don't have to pay the minimum wage, but if you intend that any of your goods are going to be shipped in interstate commerce, then you do have to pay the minimum wage or you can't ship them in interstate commerce. And then in 42, they went a step further. In Wickard versus Felburn, we had a acreage allotment where quotas were established. Farmers could grow only a certain amount of crops, a certain number of acres of wheat, for example. And this particular farmer, Felburn, had raised wheat in excess of his 23-acre quota, but instead of selling the excess wheat to the elevator, he fed it to his own pigs on his own farm. And he was prosecuted for this. And he says, well, where do you get the authority to prosecute me? And the United States government said, under the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8. And he said, oh, wait a minute. How does the wheat that I grow on my own farm and feed to my own pigs constitute interstate commerce? They didn't even pay for it. And the court said, very easy. If you hadn't raised that excess acreage of wheat, you would have had to purchase wheat from the elevator to feed your pigs, and that would have involved interstate commerce. Or you would have had to use some of your other wheat to feed your pigs. That meant you couldn't have sold that wheat at the elevator, so that would have affected interstate commerce. So now the court has said that anything that remotely or potentially affects interstate commerce is subject to regulation. So you can virtually leave out that limitation among the several states and just simply say that Congress has the authority to regulate commerce over and out, virtually no exceptions. Congress has the authority to make rules for naturalization and bankruptcy, to coin money, regulate the value of money, to punish counterfeiting, to establish post offices and post roads, copyrights and patents, to establish federal courts below the Supreme Court. I'll talk more about that in Article 3. To define and punish piracy on the high seas, and to violate the law of nations, to declare war, to grant letters of marque and reprisal. This means the authority given to a commercial ship captain to seize foreign ships, the power to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a navy. Note the difference in terms. Raise and support implies that armies are to be a more temporary thing. The basic idea of defense was a reserve militia consisting of the able-bodied male citizenry. You can't really run a navy that way, so the navy was thought of as a more permanent force. So the term provide and maintain a navy. To provide rules of discipline for the military forces, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. On an issue like gays in the military, for example, well, the president is the commander-in-chief. Congress makes the basic rules, and if Congress would decide to pass a federal statute saying no gays in the military, the president's hands would be tied. Congress takes precedence there. Congress may provide for calling the militia into federal service to execute federal laws or suppress insurrections or repel invasions, may organize and arm and discipline the militia. Congress controls the militia while it's in federal service, but the states reserve the right to appoint militia officers subject to the discipline of Congress. Interesting issue could arise if the president were to say that we're admitting gays into the military, and the governor of one state were to say, not in my National Guard, you're not. We might have a very interesting constitutional issue arise out of this one. Congress has the authority to control the District of Columbia, and then Clause 18, the power to do what is necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers and other powers granted to Congress. This is often called the elastic clause because it expands federal power. And sometimes people think this means whatever Congress can't do under the preceding 17 clauses, they can do it under this. Well, that's not the meaning. This has to be related to one of the foregoing powers. For example, the power to establish post offices. Well, I don't read anything in there about establishing stamps, printing stamps, or about having scales in the post offices or anything like that. But we would say that these things are necessary and proper for executing the power to establish post offices. In a case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, Justice Marshall, an absolutely brilliant justice, whether you agree with all his opinions or not, speaks about whether or not Congress has the authority to establish a national bank. Nothing in Article 1, Section 8 says Congress has that authority. But it does say that Congress has the authority to coin money and to borrow money and fix standards and so on. And Marshall says you could reasonably say that a national bank is suited to accomplishing those ends. But is that necessary? Well, Marshall says, and he spends much of his opinion really convincing us, very effectively I might add, that necessary doesn't really mean necessary. He says we don't always use the term necessary in the sense of absolutely indispensable. For example, I told Mike, I need a podium here. It is necessary that I have a podium in order to conduct this lecture series. Well, I don't mean by that that I couldn't possibly conduct this lecture series without a podium. I could do it. But this is an effective tool that helps me in doing so. And Marshall says that's the way we commonly use the word necessary. But notice by that interpretation how he is opening the door to a much broader interpretation of federal power. And then he doesn't give nearly as much time to an interpretation of the word proper, but essentially he seems to be saying that proper means not forbidden by some other provision of the Constitution. Quickly, Section 9 contains some limits on congressional authority. The framers thought contracts were semi-sacred, and that your right to make a contract and expect to enforce it in the courts was a right that even the states could not violate. But in a case in 1934, Home Building and Loan Association versus Blaisdell, where the Minnesota legislature had passed a Mortgage Moratorium Act saying that banks cannot foreclose on people who haven't paid their mortgages for a period of time, the court said, well, given the nature of the emergency here, the depression and the like, we think that this is a reasonable measure. I mean, it doesn't mean that the banks aren't ever going to get their money. It's just going to be delayed some. And so we think this is reasonable. And you can see their reasoning, but what they have effectively done here is they have written into the Constitution a word that is not there. Instead of saying that the states may not impair the obligation of contracts, the court has said the states may not unreasonably impair the obligation of contracts. Now, maybe that's what the founders should have said, but they didn't. The court has effectively amended the Constitution.